everyone, this is Tim with Life Center Ministries. Today we're going to be looking at Acts chapter 25, reading from the NASB. I'll put donation info on the screen real quick for anyone interested in donating to Life Center Ministries. We have over 72,000 subscribers at the making of this video. Thanks so much for the support. Please like, subscribe, comment, share. Acts 25, reading from the NASB. So we left off in 24. We see a transition in governorship from Felix to Festus. Felix does not let Paul go. He does not release him. And we talked about in Acts 24 how he very well could have been breaking Roman law here by not releasing Paul. After 2 years without a guilty ruling, Paul should have been released. He should have been free to go. Yet Felix, trying to appease the Jews, worried about what's man's opinion more than God's opinion, chooses to not release Paul. And so that's where we pick up with Festus taking over as governor in Acts 25. Verse 1, Festus, then after arriving in the province, went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea 3 days later. And the chief priests and the leading men of the Jews brought charges against Paul, and they were pleading with Festus, requesting a concession against Paul, that he might have brought him to Jerusalem, at the same time setting an ambush to kill him on the way. Festus then answered Paul was being kept in custody in Caesarea, and that he himself was about to leave shortly. Therefore, he said, have the influential men among you go there with me, and if there's anything wrong about this man, have them bring charges against him. So again, we see the transition from Antonius Felix to Porcius Festus. Felix, as we talked about in the last video as well, history tells us he was not a good guy. He was hostile to the Jews. He murdered Jews. He was not a good man. He was a former slave who became a governor, and this was the first governor that was a former slave, and he did this because his brother knew Emperor Claudius at the time. We got into that. Tacitus, the Roman historian, said that he exercised the authority of a king with the spirit of a slave. Just giving a brief summary of this stuff here. We spent more time in the last video. He persuaded a married woman, Drusilla, to become his third wife. He employed assassins to murder the high priest Jonathan. He ordered the massacre of thousands of Jews in Caesarea, and in the process, thousands more homes of the Jewish people were looted and robbed, among other things. So Felix was not a good man. History tells us that. Yet, uh, the Jews flattered him. Tertullus gave him this false flattery that we talked about. And that's exactly what it was. It was false flattery. They were trying to get him to do something they wanted him to do. This Felix would not have been a friend of the Jews in any way, shape, or form. Now, Porcius Festus, on the contrary, was a relatively good man, history tells us. He was only in office for 3 years, from 59. That's the setting here, is around 59 AD. Porcius Festus was governor for 3 years until 62 AD. He died while in office, and he was the first governor of this Judea to die in office. It was the only time this happened, and he died of natural causes, no foul play or anything, from what I understand. So, which would tell us he was an older man. And history describes him as fair and honest and capable, a man who took his duties seriously as governor. And we see he went to Jerusalem after only 3 days. It tells us he was expedient. He was going to Jerusalem. I assume he was not just going to Jerusalem to deal with this issue of Paul. He probably had other reasons to go to Jerusalem, but while he was there, he dealt with this issue. And then we see, even after 2 years, the Jewish leaders still want Paul dead. And it says that they were pleading in verse 2, they were pleading with Festus, requesting a concession against Paul. And some versions translate this, they kept beseeching, or they kept pursuing. They were very persistent here, is the idea, about this issue with Paul. And they knew Paul would be acquitted if there was a trial, so they didn't really want that. What they wanted, it was to set up an ambush like we saw in Acts 24, um, and they wanted to kill him. before they could even get to a trial. And now, keep in mind, this is the Jewish religious leaders of the day. This is the High Council. This is the Sanhedrin. This is the spiritual leaders of this time that are plotting this assassination. And so the actions here show us the danger of a religion that is not in true contact or relationship with God. If your religion makes you a liar or a murderer, then there's probably something wrong with your religion, or at the very least, your perception or understanding of that religion. In Acts 23, so we saw the zealots, not in 24, it was 23, we saw the zealots, or potentially the Sakari, which was the subgroup of zealots that we referred to as daggermen. They were the ones that plot this attack and they bring it to the Jewish leaders. And in this case, it seems to be that it's the Jewish leaders themselves that are planning this ambush and the killing of Paul. And so we don't know if Festus knew here of their intentions or not, but he refuses the request to have Paul brought to Jerusalem. He was willing to put him on trial again, but it had to be done in Caesarea. He was not going to bend on that without Paul's consent. Picking up in verse 6, after Festus had spent no more than 8 or 10 days among them, he went down to Caesarea, and on the next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered that Paul be brought. So the tribunal is the judgment seat. Many translations translated exactly that, the judgment seat. So once again, here we see Paul on trial before a Gentile ruler being accused by Jewish leaders. And picking up in 7. After Paul arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him, which they could not prove. While Paul said in his own defense, I have not done anything wrong either against the law of the Jews, or against the temple, or against Caesar. But Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, replied to Paul and said, Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me on these charges? So Festus, the idea here, it says in verse 9, uh, wanting to do the Jews a favor. And I think a better translation here from the Greek would be to gain favor with the Jews. So Festus, looking to gain favor with the Jews, asks Paul this question. And to be clear, he says, stand on trial before me on these charges in Jerusalem. What that would really look like is to stand on trial before the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem in the presence of Porcius Festus. And so Paul is not going to go for that. Paul knows if his fate is left up to the Jewish religious leaders, then it's over for Paul. So he's going to push back on that, and he rejects that. Um, so Paul refuses to go to Jerusalem, and Festus, again here, just like Felix, finds it difficult to make a decision. In verse 10, Paul says, I am not standing, uh, Paul says, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. I have done nothing wrong to the Jews, as you very well know. And maybe a better translation here is, you should know better, or you know better than this. So Paul, talking to Governor Festus, says, I've done nothing wrong, and you should know this. You know better than this. Um, verse 11, if therefore I am in the wrong and have committed something deserving death, I am not trying to avoid execution. But if there is nothing to the accusations which these men are bringing against me, no one can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. Verse 12, then when Festus had conferred with his council, he answered, You have appealed to Caesar you shall go. So essentially, this was like appealing to the Supreme Court of the Roman Empire at this time, and every citizen had a right, after initial trials failed to reach a decision, to make this appeal to the emperor or to Caesar. And so the governor here also has a right. Festus could have said no, and he confers with his council and he signs off on it, and says, To Caesar you shall go. And now this Caesar who Paul appealed to was Nero. And Nero had begun his reign about 5 years earlier in 54 AD. Again, we're around 59 AD at the time. So Nero's early reign, though, it was peaceful up until this point. He was regarded as a wise and just ruler. His early years gave no hint of the cruelties that would follow later in his reign in the coming years. Picking up in 13. Now, when several days had passed, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived in Caesarea, paying their respects to Festus. And while they were spending many days there, Festus presented Paul's case to the king, saying, "There is a man who was left as a prisoner by Felix. And when I was in Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him." Verse 16, I replied to them that it is not the custom of the Romans to hand over any person before the accused meets his accusers face to face and has an opportunity to make his defense against the charges. So after they had assembled there, I did not delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. Verse 18, when the accusers stood up, they did not begin bringing any charges against him of crimes that I suspected, but they simply had some points of disagreement with him about their own religion and about a dead man, Jesus, whom Paul asserted to be alive. Verse 20, and being at a loss how to investigate such matters, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these matters. But when Paul appealed to be held in custody for the emperor's decision, I ordered that he be kept in custody until I send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him. So, again, this is Herod Agrippa II. We talked about him a little bit in Acts 24, and his sister, who is also his mistress, Bernice. And these are also the siblings of Drusilla, who was Felix's wife, third wife. We talked about this. Reference Acts 24 video for more on that. Agrippa was known as an expert in Jewish customs and religious matters. Agrippa was Jewish by ethnicity. Not that he practiced Judaism, but he was a Jewish man. His grandpa, Herod the Great, tried to kill Jesus as a baby. His great grandpa was Herod the Great, tried to kill Jesus as a baby. His grandpa had John the Baptizer beheaded, and his father murdered the first apostle we read about in the early Acts, which was James. And now here's Paul standing before the great grandson of Herod the Great. Although this was outside of King Agrippa's jurisdiction, he could provide insight potentially to Festus as where to go from here and maybe some advisory role. And Agrippa, we know, was the last of the Herodian dynasty, and history tells us that he actually sided with Rome when they destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD. And picking up in verse 23, Paul before Agrippa. So on the next day, when Agrippa and Bernice came amid great pomp and entered the auditorium, accompanied by the commanders and the prominent men of the city, at the command of Festus, Paul was brought before them. And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all you gentlemen present with us, you see this man about whom all the people of the Jews appealed to me, both in Jerusalem and here, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. 25. But I found that he had committed nothing deserving death, and since he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to send him. Yet I have nothing definite about him to write to my lord. Therefore, I have brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the investigation has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems absurd to me in sending a prisoner not to indicate the charges against him as well. So this was not just a hearing of evidence, but it turned into a large public event, almost a spectacle of sorts. It was in the auditorium in Caesarea, and I'm sure Paul saw this as another great opportunity to spread the message about Christ and to tell his story. And these people here, they come in with all this pomp and this pageantry, and I'm sure they seemed important at the time, but this is an interesting point, a time to look at how here's Paul shackled in chains for no reason, this innocent man, and then you have all these people that seemed important. But look how history tells the story. Looking back a couple thousand years, who's important now? And so Festus makes it clear, verse 24, that he has found no wrongdoing in Paul. Uh, Verse 25, he says, I have found nothing deserving of death. And so he finds no wrongdoing, and Festus was hoping to at least have something to write in a letter to Nero. As of now, he had nothing to even write, and so he couldn't just write a letter saying, I don't really know what this man is accused of. He's more than likely innocent, but I went ahead and sent him to you. This would be frowned upon by a busy emperor who would see it as a waste of his precious time, and this would not be a good way for Governor Festus here to start his reign as governor to make a poor decision like this. So he's concerned, what am I going to say if I send him to Nero? What do I have? What's my reasoning? And maybe he was clearly hoping to get that out of this event. This, it's not really a trial, more like this public hearing of sorts. And so now Paul, when we pick up in 26, and just in the last few chapters, not to mention the Jewish mob that he stood before, and the Sanhedrin that he stood before, but he stood before now the rulers Felix, Festus, and now he will stand before Agrippa, King Agrippa II, as we get into Acts 26. But that's all we have for Acts 25. Um, I'll put donation info up on the screen briefly, and thank you so much for watching. Join us for Acts 26 coming soon. Thank you.